Imagine having the world at your fingertips, a great college career at a huge university, being a top 5 pick in the NFL draft, and being given the keys to a storied NFL franchise at quarterback. You'd have millions of dollars, thousands of fans, but for one man, none of that was enough. Art Schlicther was the 4th overall pick of the 1982 NFL draft, but is more remembered for his crippling gambling addiction and crime spree that caused him to lose it all. Today, we will be going over the story of Art Schlicther, the man who gambled everything away. First, we need to know a bit more about Art Schlichter's early life and how he became a national phenom at quarterback. Born in Bloomingburg, Ohio, on April 25, 1960, Schlicther was a promising athlete, excelling as a quarterback at Miami Trace High School. His on-field dominance was unparalleled, going undefeated in 30 starts with only one tie marring his record. However, his early success on the football field was overshadowed by a budding addiction to gambling. It started innocently enough, pooling resources with friends to bet on harness races at Scioto Downs near Columbus, but quickly spiraled into a habit that would define his life. Scioto Downs became his regular haunt, a place where the thrill of winning fueled a compulsion that would eventually erode his career, relationships, and freedom. He was recruited to Ohio State University, which was a legendary team right in his backyard. At the time, he was the starting quarterback under Hall of Fame coach Woody Hayes. Many say that Hayes was so impressed by Schlichter's ability that he was willing to rework the entire offense to be more pass-centric, despite the fact he had most of his success with a run-focused offense. It was actually a Schlichter interception that enraged Hayes so much that he assaulted Charlie Bauman, a linebacker for Clemson, during the 1978 Gator Bowl. This assault would lead to Hayes being fired, and this would cause an outburst of secret gambling from Schlichter, who knew the incoming coach couldn't keep him as restrained. From 1978 to 1981, Schlichter threw for 7,500 yards, 50 touchdowns, and 46 interceptions. He led the team to several great seasons and even got them to the national championship game in 1980, where they fell short to the USC Trojans. During his college career, he still frequented the Scioto Downs with other prominent gamblers from the area. His fame as the starting quarterback for the college team gave him lots of connections to people wanting to party and gamble with him, and this temptation was just too much for Art to resist. By the end of his college career, he had been losing thousands of dollars on gambling. It's even been reported that Hayes' replacement Earl Bruce helped cover up a lot of his gambling problems to keep him eligible. Due to these cover-ups, NFL teams were not really aware that he had a gambling issue while thinking about him in the draft. There were whispers, sure, but both Art and his coach denied these rumors had any validity to them. Obviously, Art wasn't going to come out and tell the professional sports leagues offering him millions that he was secretly gambling all the money he had in his possession. The coach covering it up seems to be the bigger issue here. I think teams would have either passed on him entirely or been able to get him resources to actually help him with his issue. However, most teams simply were unaware that he had developed a crippling gambling addiction during his childhood. The Colts were in desperate need for a franchise quarterback. They were still located in Baltimore at the time, but they decided to draft Schlichter with the 4th overall pick of the 1982 NFL draft. They also would draft Mike Pagel in the 4th round at quarterback, but he was assumed to be a potential career backup that would be molded by the Colts system to plug in when Art was potentially injured. Art had clearly been struggling with substances and gambling pretty hard before reporting to training camp that year. He had become a household name for his draft status and play in Ohio, and when he got to team meetings, he was described as distracted and severely out of shape. He would end up losing the starting role to Mike Pagel going into his rookie season, but the organization still believed they could get him into shape, and he was the future. By halfway through his rookie season, he had blown his entire $350,000 signing bonus by gambling. When adjusted for inflation, that is an astounding $1.1 million he had spent over the course of 6 months. Even before he had been drafted, he had found himself thousands of dollars in debt to illegal bookies. When the season had been partially canceled by a strike, he had lost over $20,000 betting on college football. Before the season even officially resumed in 1982, his debt had ballooned to nearly $700,000. However, this debt was covered up by Art, and he would proceed to keep gambling despite already being in such a deep hole he would never be able to escape it. He lost another $500,000 in spring of 1983, and this time the bookies threatened to either physically hurt him or expose him to the NFL if he didn't pay up. Even today, with legal gambling, players aren't allowed to bet on games, so at the time, this would have definitely ended his career immediately. Deciding that he was in harm's way and it was over either way, he went to the FBI in March of of 1983 and helped get the bookies he owed money to arrested on federal charges. He also decided to come clean to the NFL, fearing that bookies would force him to throw games in order to recoup their losses. He was indefinitely suspended in early 1983, and Pete Rozelle would meet with Art and decide to give him a second chance. He was given a 13-month suspension from the NFL, but as long as he agreed to get professional help for gambling addiction, he would eventually be allowed to play once again. While he put on a good front and pretended he had changed his ways and actually was on the straight and narrow, he would later admit that he was gambling during his suspension and the 1984 season. Just 5 games into the 1985 season, he was released by the Colts when they got credible reports he was gambling once again. The NFL offered Schlicther a polygraph to determine if he had still been gambling, but the Colts management decided they had enough and released him anyway. He would later sign as a free agent with the Buffalo Bills in 1986, but he would never play again in the NFL. While his football career was over at this point, it was just the beginning of him deciding to break laws and blatantly steal money to keep up with his gambling addiction. In 1987, he was arrested in New York City for his connection to a multi-million-dollar sport betting operation that was operating illegally with his involvement. Somehow he managed to get only probation for this violation, but it would come to officially end his career in the NFL. While the Bengals had wanted to sign Art as a credible backup quarterback, in 1987, the deal was vetoed by Pete Rozelle, and this arrest in New York was cited as evidence that he hadn't changed his ways and was still addicted to gambling. When he filed another appeal to have his suspension lifted, he was denied once again and soon filed for bankruptcy to attempt to shield himself from creditors. At this point, he was thousands of dollars in debt to dozens of different people. All of these loans and deals may have been presented as an investment or an autograph, but the proceeds actually went to fueling his gambling addiction. He did sign a contract with the CFL to play for the Ottawa Rough Riders, but would break his ribs halfway through the season where he was later released. Needing to make money by any means necessary to keep up with his addiction, he would go on to play in the Arena Football League and actually was the league MVP in 1991. He suddenly retired in 1992, but it would later be announced that his retirement was a cover-up. The AFL commissioners had found evidence that Schlicther had actually been gambling on his own AFL games. While he had been performing well and had led a team to a championship and playoff berth, they just couldn't allow him to continue playing while actively betting on games he participated in. Schlicther decided if he could beat the league to the announcement and retire, they probably wouldn't announce it publicly. After all, a startup football league doesn't need the bad press of its players gambling on their own games. He had predicted it correctly, and he was allowed to retire in peace. After officially retiring, he became the host of a radio show in Cincinnati. He did very well at this job and began to openly speak about his recovery from gambling addiction. He had such good ratings in Cincinnati that he was eventually offered a job on a Las Vegas radio show, but he would be fired a few months in for stealing checks from the radio station owner in order to use the funds in more gambling. At this point, he had burned most of the bridges in the sports or entertainment world that he could use to make easy money, and he became a lot more determined to get his hands on large sums of money so he could keep betting on games. He had always been trying to pass bad checks and con people out of money, but soon he was regularly being arrested for trying to write bad checks to casinos to cover his gambling losses. Between 1987 and 1992, he was arrested a staggering 3 times in Ohio for writing over $50,000 worth of bad checks. For some reason, when the gambling addict decided to move to Las Vegas, things didn't get better. If only someone could have possibly seen that coming. Things got so bad that he would even steal his wife's wedding ring and pawn it in order to get money to gamble. Eventually, when the FBI were contacted over Art stealing checks from his sister-in-law, his wife would leave him and take their 2 kids back to Indiana. Art would move back to Indiana, but his actions in Las Vegas would come back to haunt him. He was charged with fraud in relation to $175,000 in bad checks to Las Vegas casinos. The feds, for some reason, even after all of his arrests, decided to give him an offer where he could report to prison camp and spend 15 months in custody before being free. However, while working on this deal, he had kept writing back checks in Indiana, and this offer was revoked. Prosecutors would discover at least $500,000 in bad checks across 3 different states through the case, and he would be sentenced to 2 years in federal prison as a result of his constant need to commit fraud and gamble. In April of 1996, he was released after 16 months and would get a job soon after. His family was hopeful that he would have learned his lesson from his time in prison, but shortly after getting a job, he was arrested again for stealing $8,500 from his employer to gamble. At this point, the court's patience with his actions was up, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for this. His wife also officially filed for divorce, realizing that Art would never be able to stop gambling and actually be the family man he had been promising to be. He was released on probation in 1999 and proceeded to immediately scam his closest family and friends by cooking up a scheme. He claimed he had the ability to get tickets to OSU football games, and if people just fronted him the money to buy tickets, he would resell them and split the profits with them. Of course, he would just immediately pocket the money and gamble, but this wasn't just random people anymore. At this point, anyone who wasn't a close friend or family member knew the type of man he was, so he instead focused on scamming people he had known for his entire life and those related to him. He ultimately stole $500,000 from a dozen individuals, including his own father. Not even caring about stealing money from his father was enough to earn him another 5 years in prison. For the next decade, Schlicther would spend almost 10 years in 44 different jails and prisons across the country. He spent only 358 days as a free man between November 1994 and June 2006. It seemed like every time he would get on probation or be released, he would just go right back to trying to scam anyone within reach and gamble. His addiction was so bad that he even paid his public defender to smuggle him a cell phone so he could place bets while in prison. He claims in interviews to have hit rock bottom in 2004 after he was caught gambling in prison and placed in solitary confinement. It was estimated at this point he owed at least $500,000 in restitution still. At this point, he shifted his sights to spreading the evils of gambling addiction. He started a non-profit where he would travel the country and share his story in an effort to get others to not gamble away their future like he did. He was in television ads, lobbying groups, radio stations, anywhere anyone would pay to hear him talk, he was going to be. In 2009, he went to a church in Westerville, Ohio, where he met up with a wealthy heiress who was recently widowed by the CEO of Wendy's. Somehow, this rich woman believed that Art had saved her son's life after he had been involved in a plane crash. Over the next several years, he would steal over $1 million from this elderly woman. In February of 2011, he was arrested on several fraud-related charges for stealing more than $1 million. Through the investigation, prosecutors found that almost immediately after Schlicther left prison, he started gambling again. He had visited casinos in Nevada, Indiana, West Virginia, riverboat casinos, and had begun his ticket buying scheme again in 2009. The entire time he had been using his nonprofit to spread his message of gambling being evil. He was actively stealing massive sums of money to continue his pursuit of wins that never came. The most embarrassing thing about this story is that Art was such a pathetic gambler, he couldn't even win. You'd think after committing felonies to fuel your gambling for 40 years, you would at least not be such a massive loser all the time. This man was a grade A con artist, but I think the corgi who makes TikToks picking winners would have been better off. The scheme had gotten so out of control that he had actually turned himself into the police and said he might have accidentally used some of the money to gamble. He would plead guilty to several charges of theft, corrupt activity, and fraud. He was sentenced to 10 years in state prison and a month later would plead guilty to federal charges of wire fraud, bank fraud, and false tax returns. While under house arrest, he would test positive for everyone's favorite powder and immediately was sentenced to 10 years in the case. He was also given $2.2 million in restitution. It's important to note that many of those who were dealing with Schlicther noted that he never brought up his wife and kids he had never seen while he was in jail. He was released from custody in August of 2020, and even after he was released, he still hasn't been able to keep out of the way of law enforcement. In 2022, he was found unresponsive in a hotel room, and they used Narcan in order to resuscitate him and transport him to a hospital. He was found to be in possession of everyone's powder once again, and this time was sentenced to 1 year of probation on these new charges. He was later found in February 2024 while standing next to his disabled vehicle, and the officer would find paraphernalia on the car floorboard. They also found paraphernalia on his person, and he would face an 11-month sentence if found guilty. He is thought to be suffering from CTE, but no amount of CTE justifies taking millions of dollars from innocent people to fuel your dumb gambling addiction. The man had a wife, kids, potential NFL contracts, and decided to throw it all away to have bookies constantly after him for owing them copious amounts of money. He abandoned everyone who ever cared about him to chase an addiction that doesn't care about him. It is interesting to see how much the discourse on gambling has changed since this. For a long time, we looked at gamblers in sports as something shameful and something that was uncommon. However, with the legalization of gambling, we've already seen several players suspended for violating gambling rules in the league. I think as time goes on, we will see a lot more players like Schlicther who are exposed to gambling at an early age and will go to literally any lengths to feed their addiction by any means necessary. Especially when addictions like this start during your formative years, they can be almost impossible to beat, and once someone loses their career, they often view it as a nothing to lose situation and take it to extremes. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to press the like button and comment down below because it really helps the video. We also post videos like this several times a week, so be sure to like and subscribe to never miss a video again. Our last video was about NFL records no one wants to have, so be sure to check that out on the screen now.